This is an example of how to use the Safety Blanket risk assessment tool to create a risk assessment. First, clicking on Documents, click on Create a New Assessment. Here you can type in the title of your risk assessment. The example I've chosen is mounting a satellite dish. Click Continue. You can add a full description and scope for the risk assessment. It could include method statement or other details pertaining to the particular task at hand. We can then move on to the next step, which is to identify any hazards associated with the risk assessment. So I'll pick a few hazards here: falls from height, falling objects, hand-arm vibration, and weather. There's a simple view where they're listed in short form, and the full hazard information where I've got additional information that might help you along your way. You can also filter the hazards by clicking the filters, so the selection changes according to your filter there. You can see each of the hazards that are added appearing down the left hand side here, and the next step will be to fill in details for each of those. So let's continue on to the next step. You can see here we're dealing with falls from height. That's the default, but you can change that. We'll then move on to decide who's affected by this hazard. We give you some typical consequences here, but you can edit these to suit your needs. And then before moving on to the next step, we need to decide if this particular hazard is trivial or significant. There's a table here to enable you to come to a reasonable decision on that, where you can select a probability of something happening and tie that into any given severity. And there's a little bit of help here. So then we move on to the next step, where we get to add our own controls, or you can use some of our existing controls, depending on the hazard you've got selected over here. The list changes accordingly. Now we might choose a few of these. So I've got a few there. They initially populated as future controls. You can move those to current controls. You can swap them around. You can edit them. And of course you can remove them as well if you need to. So then moving on to the next step. This is where we'll evaluate how effective our current controls are and how our future controls might affect the risk in the future. So I'll take some ratings there. And next. And you notice we've now moved on to the next hazard. So now we'll be looking at working through each of the hazards in turn in exactly the same way as I've just done. There's another feature that is worth demonstrating here. Should we evaluate a hazard as a insignificant or low risk, we can record it as a trivial risk. Now there are various reasons for doing this that you can look up on the HSE website. Okay, so I've continued through and put details in for these other hazards here. One thing you may notice for the current controls, future controls, is a lack of PPE. We ask you to do this at the end. PPE is considered the least effective control methods, although when reading a risk assessment it's often the most useful thing that you need to see. Simply select the PPE required for any given task. If you click twice, it deselects. And save and move on to the next step. So as a conclusion to the risk assessment, the default is to stop until the risk assessment is complete at least. So you could decide that the task is safe to go ahead even though the additional controls have not yet been implemented, or you could perhaps wait until the future controls have been implemented. And a review period. We give it the option of never, but 1 year is typical, and that's what we default to. So this is the final step of the risk assessment process. We've got a summary screen here telling us that we've filled in all of these sections correctly. We appear to have something that requires attention here on the weather. So if I click on that, we can see here I've missed some details off, which I can now save in there. And return back to the publish screen. Okay, so we now are ready to publish. There's nothing stopping us actually going back, identifying further hazards, adding them in, or even removing existing ones. In this instance, we will publish our risk assessment. So here's our published risk assessment, mounting a satellite dish. We've got a unique reference number that's been assigned to that. Got a summary. And you've got PPE. So further down, you can see details that have been entered for each of the hazards. And right at the bottom there, we've got the insignificant hazards that are listed without the details. So you can see just here, the option that I selected was to wait until all of the future controls were in place before continuing with this task. So the future controls are listed over here, and I can complete each one in turn. You'll notice here the colour is for a high risk, whereas I complete all of the controls there, the risk assessment is now ready to go, and the overall hazard rating has dropped. We can see that particular assessment on our risk assessment summary screen just there. So when the time comes to reassess this particular assessment, if I click on it to see the summary, I can review and start a review. What this has done is created a copy, leaving the original completely intact, and I can now go through and make changes. So I'll make a few changes here. Now ready to publish version 2. I should do so. So having gone through and made a few changes, you can now see that the risk assessment is at version 2 and has now been published. One thing you may notice, the order of the hazards is listed down here, and not in the order that you entered them in, but instead in the order of risk rating. Highest is at the top, falling away to low. So I've implemented a new feature control there, so I can put that one in place.